debate. The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, I'm very pleased to finally get a chance to discuss my bill, C-504, which seeks to support volunteer firefighters. Before I discuss my bill as such, I would like to discuss fire departments because this is something directly related. You have to understand that fire services don't only respond to fires, but also to calls to help out people stuck in car crashes or people who have medical problems where ambulances cannot gain access to them, such as a hunter who fell out of his tower in an inaccessible place. So they don't just deal with fires. I think it's important to point that out. Now, we must also understand that fire departments are organized differently in rural and urban areas. In urban areas, there's a sufficient number of calls to have professional firefighters who are full-time, who've been trained professionally, and who are there to respond to calls. Whereas in rural areas, the volume of calls is insufficient to maintain that kind of staffing. Sometimes there are a few permanent firefighters who also do administrative work, but obviously you can't have full-time firefighting staff when you have a village of 1,000 people and that serves maybe a few other communities of 300 or 400 people in the surrounding area. There would not be a cost benefit that's reasonable there. So there's no choice. These are volunteer firefighters who do the job.
And here, I want you to understand very clearly that these are volunteers. It doesn't mean that they're not paid, but to really understand what the issue is here is that they're going of their own goodwill to go. No one is going to tell them that they have to do that. It's really the desire to help the community and serve, and therefore that is why the person becomes a volunteer firefighter, to save lives and help my friends, say, if they're going to lose their house or something, help them to save some of their assets. And really it's just through their very good will that they decide to serve their community. Now, when we talk about answering a call, we have to have a full crew. So it's a certain number, a minimum number of firefighters who can go, and that can vary from fire to fire. But before gathering that number of people, they can't necessarily enter a building and man an operation as they would want to. So until they reach that critical number, they'll water down the building and wait for others to arrive. So of course, for every minute extra that it takes to reach that critical number could result in lives being lost, or assets that will never be recovered, material damage that's done, and that's more serious. I think that everyone realizes that a life, you can't put a price on anyone's life, but the material damage is something that can be assessed. And I think that it's important to think of the millions of dollars in insurance claims that are paid out by those companies. So being able to act more quickly represents lives that are saved and millions of dollars that are saved as well. Sometimes the things that are lost are irreplaceable because of their sentimental value. I'll tell you what one of my constituents wrote to me to emphasize this. She said, I was a volunteer firefighter, and I know that the first few minutes of fighting a fire are the most critical. People go out as volunteers to save lives, and it's not always the easiest thing to do when it's 30 below zero. Another volunteer firefighter from Rouyn-Noranda wrote to me and said that his employer would not let him leave to go on a call because there was no one to replace him. Or they could only leave on the second alarm if a replacement had been found. So I think it's important to make people aware and make employers aware of the work that is done by these firefighters and to have them protected by the law. Roger Rousseau de la Sarre also wrote to me and said that the cooperation of the employer is necessary for the firefighter to be able to work. So the key factor for efficiency and rapidity. There's availability, of course, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year will make the service, of course, more effective. But the constant challenge is to get the crew together between 6 in the morning and 6 at night. I also want to emphasize that there are many companies that have trans-Canadian activities that rely on voluntary firefighters. In the case of emergency, there's Enbridge, Canadian National, Canadian Pacific, and TransCanada. These are all companies that count on volunteer firefighters to respond to the catastrophes that might occur in rural regions of the country. And they also need people to come quickly and act when we're talking about those kinds of possible accidents. So the presence of voluntary firefighters is a critical service for the Canadian economy across the country. We can't predict when a catastrophe or a disaster will occur, but I think we can put all of the chances on our side if we are ready. This bill would contribute to helping Canada to be ready to respond to disasters such as these. And the Insurance Bureau of Canada recently published a study saying that we have to be ready. We have to wake up and stop imagining that everything is fine. There are perhaps measures that we could take to help us be more ready. So the objective of my bill is to provide the right for a volunteer firefighter or part-time employee in a business under federal jurisdiction to leave their work if they are called upon to intervene and if the employer has been informed of their obligations. So it would allow people who are under federal jurisdiction respond to those calls, and all they have to do is inform their employer. And you can't just suddenly spring that as a surprise on the employer. I mean, the employer knows this in advance. They've been advised of the possibility of this occurring, and the employer would have to let the person go. Now, what's very important to specify as well is that there's the obligation to allow the person to leave unless there are very valid reasons to not do so, because sometimes it might not be applicable, and I think it's important to understand this. There is a logic that underlies all of this. It's clear that if the entire factory would stop running because one person leaves, because they're on a critical piece of equipment, well, the employer could have a valid reason in such a case to not allow the person to leave. You'd have to wait until there is a replacement. If that person is the only security guard in a bank, for example, well, it's logical that they not just leave from one second to the next. There were security concerns there. So there is a logic to all of this that would allow an employer, if they had valid reasons to not allow the employee to leave, to not do so. But if those valid reasons don't exist, they have to let the person go on the call. It also prohibits reprisals against volunteer firefighters or part-time firefighters who have to leave their workplace to act as a firefighter. And it prohibits, for example, them facing any action because they did respond to the call, or someone who calls in the morning saying, I'm sorry, I was at a fire from 6 at night till 6 in the morning, and I haven't slept yet, so I can't work today. And that would this would mean that the employer can't take disciplinary measures in such a circumstance. It protects the firefighters. So that's a concrete example. It also bans the employer from, or it prohibits the employer from refusing to hire someone because they are a volunteer firefighter. If the boss says, well, I think that's pretty troublesome, I don't think I'll hire you because after that I'll have to manage your calls, and that would become illegal. So I want also to emphasize that usually there's good cooperation, but it's not always the case. I'd also like to take the time to just give a concrete example so that people understand what the problem is in terms of this. So in Quebec, there's a similar piece of legislation that exists for employees under provincial jurisdiction. So it protects them. With my bill, this would have the effect of protecting all employees under federal jurisdiction. So because of the two different bills, the two different laws, it would cover most all of the volunteer firefighters in Quebec. There aren't any similar laws in other provinces and territory, but I think that this bill could also encourage debate in other provinces and territories and encourage them to follow suit. So a current example, if there's somebody who works in a caisse populaire, which is something that would happen often in Quebec, this person would have to be allowed to leave to respond to a call. But if the same person is being trained and leaves, well, the same and does the same job in a bank, well, then the employer would no longer have to have no longer have the obligation to let them leave, because it's federal. So it makes no sense. Just the mere fact of changing jurisdiction doesn't protect the firefighter. So I think there needs to be a good balance here. And because of the problems for the municipalities who are more and more in need of this, the training is much longer than it used to be in the past, and some people prefer to spend more time with their families for various reasons, and it's becoming more and more difficult to recruit people to do this work. And the people who, if on top of that, those people are trained but they're not allowed to go to calls, or people come to see us and say, well, I'd like to be a firefighter, and the service says, well, I'd like to know if your employer is prepared to let you go on calls, and the employer says, well, no, I'm not going to let that person leave. Well, they can't take the risk of hiring them to do this and spend thousands of dollars on training if they aren't certain that they'll be able to go and take those calls in the end. So it's quite simple. I think that what we have to understand here is that we really want to value the roles of these firefighters in our communities. What I want with this bill is to say, yes, I hope the entire Canadian Parliament will say that they believe in what these firefighters do, that they deserve to be protected and be allowed to go and respect their obligations. That is why we need to send this bill to committee. Perhaps there are a few legal corrections that need to be made. I never claimed that it was completely perfect as it is, but I think if we send it to committee and improve it, if there are legal improvements that need to be made, for partisan reasons, I think that it really is worth sending it to committee and saying that say that we really are going to appreciate the work of these firefighters in our communities. We'll ensure that they are protected, their role is appreciated, and in that way, when improvements are made, at least we might save lives. We might be able to intervene more quickly. So 85% of firefighters are volunteers in Canada, and that represents 127,000 people approximately. This is a bill that would cost absolutely nothing. It wouldn't cost anything in the federal government's budget. And even in the speech from the throne, there was talk about the ability to respond when there are natural disasters. So having firefighters who are able to respond in such circumstances is exactly in line with what was said. So I think it's really important to strengthen our community's capacities to react. And this is something very simple that we can do that will help them. And just send this bill to committee and afterwards pass it for the well-being of our firefighters and our communities. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Question et comment.
Questions and comments?
It's the honourable member for Etobicoke Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her speech in a private member's bill. She's a hardworking member that I had the privilege to work with on Defence Committee before, and she has spent time several years in the Canadian Armed Forces herself, and I'd like to thank her for her dedication to that. And I know when she's talking about volunteer firefighters, she's sincere about and demonstrating goodwill. However, I would remind her that when we did give a tax break to that segment, the volunteer firefighters, none of her party stood up and supported this government in doing that. But the question I have for her is the relationship between volunteer firefighters and their employers are generally quite strong, and by convention, the relationship is very good between employers and volunteer firefighters, that there really hasn't been a need for this kind of legislation, because employers are very receptive to the great work that volunteer firefighters do, which I think all members of this House will agree on. And I would like to ask her if she doesn't think that perhaps what she's proposing may not damage those relationships between those firefighters and their employers.
Honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like first of all to specify that for the tax credit for firefighters had been on its own and not tied to so many other different measures, I would have happily supported it. I would have voted on just that. I certainly would have voted for it. Now, he knows how it works in the Parliament. We put some good measures among many others that are not, and that is what causes the problem. Now, what you have to understand is that employers, we have no way of seeing statistics on who frees up those firefighters to go and respond to those fires, but those cases do exist. If we have a bill that says that employers are obliged to free those volunteer firefighters up, well, people won't hesitate anymore. There won't be any reticence. Legally speaking, I have to let this person go. So we'll find another solution. We'll find a way to make it work. But when there isn't that obligation, I think there's less of a will to do that and find the right solution. I think it's just an issue. That's exactly the issue. In Quebec, there haven't been a huge number of complaints, especially since they tabled the provincial legislation. But employers just say, as I said, well, I have to find another solution so I can manage to free this person up. Questions and comments?
Comments, l'honorable député de Sainte-Marie.
Honourable member for Sainte-Marie-Champlain. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a riding in which I have many, many volunteer firefighters. I believed that those firefighters depended or reported to the municipality and not through the federal government. And so it seems to me, well, I don't understand very clearly how the federal government can come and intervene in an area of jurisdiction that really is purely municipal. The honourable member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue, you have 1 minute, 25 seconds. Well, I'll try and explain this clearly for my colleague. I thought it was simple. It's that volunteer firefighters have another job outside of their work as a firefighter, and some work for or in positions that are under federal jurisdiction. For example, if they work in a bank, if they work as a mailman, or something like that. But currently, the provincial legislation obliges employers who have employees under their jurisdiction to free those people up. But if the employer is under federal jurisdiction currently, they're not obliged to free those people up to go fight the fire. So what we're doing is that amending the Canada Labour Code so that employees under federal jurisdiction will have the obligation to free those employees who are also volunteer firefighters, and it is in that way that we are going to act. There are several other aspects that affect firefighters under provincial or municipal jurisdiction, and that's why they're not in my bill, in this bill. I chose to concentrate uniquely on people who work in positions that are under federal jurisdiction. That is why it's worded the way it is.
The débat